My presence here is in part because Andy's out of town, but also because this is the beginning of Climate Action Justice Week. So it's an event that's held all over the country this Sunday, Friday, and Saturday, depending on your religious tradition, and through the week. So there are sermons preached, there are workshops done, there are gardens planted, there are work projects enacted in care for Mother Earth. And so that's part of the reason I'm here to talk about the work of Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. Now, I want to tell you a story about a church that I visited in Sahuarita a few weeks ago. Dennis St. John is here. I wasn't going to name the church, and then he and his family show up today, and it's Good Shepherd United Church of Christ, doing a lot of good work, especially in immigration and feeding the hungry, and doing a lot of good environmental work as well. So I was down there for actually the fourth time in the last 3 years, and before I went down for the fourth time, one of my board members happened to be at Good Shepherd Church and said, "So I hear Doug Bland is coming to speak here again." And they said, "Oh, yeah, we enjoy having Doug here. He tells some good stories." And my board member said, "So you know about Arizona Interfaith Power and Light?" And they just gave her this blank stare. What is that, a power company? And so when I went down there for the fourth time, I told them this story about my board member coming there and me having been there 3 times, yet the members of the church don't remember anything about Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. So we did this call and response. The call was, what was I talking about? And the response from the congregation that I invited was, Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. So you catch on quickly. What was I talking about? Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. Good. So let me tell you just a little bit about it. 85040 has been called the most toxic zip code, not in the county, not in the state, but in the nation. 85040 is the Rio Salado area. It's where all these toxic plants got placed when they, rather than being placed in Scottsdale or Paradise Valley or Chandler, they get stuck there. It's an example of environmental racism. So we have done work with congregations in that zip code to do energy audits, and one church, St. Matthew's Catholic Church, we estimated that we saved them, because we did an energy audit and then a retrofit, mostly of lighting. We saved them about $4,000 that they can use for ministry and mission. Food justice is one of our emphases. We're trying to find ways so that climate change is not just an issue that has to do with melting ice caps and polar bears, that it's right there in our everyday lives. So 15 to 18% of our carbon footprint is made up of the food that we eat, mostly because it travels so far to get to our table. We do work at the Corporation Commission, where we're working to get dark, dirty money out of politics. I was going to bring my petition for you to sign, but I came to worship last Sunday. And Terry Goddard, the man himself was here talking about it. So I left my petition at home. You're doing that. One of the things that we do, I take this with me to climate justice events. It's what I call my eco-fessional. So I've got a stack of penances that I hand out to people. I invite them to confess their ecological sin. You know, this is such a serious issue that we face, but it's so serious and sometimes scary that we get paralyzed by it. So we try to take another approach to climate change and try to use a little bit of humor. So I was at this climate change event, and there was somebody from Franciscan Renewal Center, brother with the brown Franciscan robes, and I went up to him with my e-confessional, and I asked him if he wanted to confess his sin. And he did, but I can't tell you. And then I've got this stack of penances, so they're cards, and I hand them out to him, give him the top one, don't know what it is. He looks at it kind of sheepish and then hands it back and says, I don't think this is a very good one for me. He hands it to me, I read it, it says, shower with a partner. So those are some of the things that Arizona Interfaith Power and Light is doing around the state. We're one of 40 state affiliates around the country. And rather than take time now to tell you more about that, I've got these sign-up sheets. Now, I didn't ask Kelly or Andy if this was permissible in a high church Unitarian Universalist liturgy. But I thought, you know, one of our goals for the year is expand our mailing list. And if you're interested in Arizona Interfaith Power and Light, I invite you to sign up for the mailing list. Kelly, maybe you could help me pass one out. Hit the choir first. Hit them hard. and then hand it out to the congregation as well. Mostly what I want to do today is tell you a story, though. But before I do, what was I talking about? Good. So the story I usually tell about why I do this work has to do with my brother, Al. Imagine any continuum, whether it's religious or political or cultural or taste. Al is at one end and I'm at the other end. The polarization that exists in our culture exists in my family, too. How many families is that true for here? So, you know, I was pretty much a straight arrow, and he was always in trouble. I was in seminary studying for the ministry, and he was flunking out of his party school, not because he wasn't bright, but because he was just always into drugs and sex and alcohol. And then he had a religious conversion experience. He says that he was watching the Super Bowl when the camera panned the end zone, and there was this guy with afro rainbow-colored hair holding a sign that said John 3:16. And he marks that as the beginning of his born-again experience. And if you think that that religious conversion experience brought us to the same side of the continuum, you would be wrong. But the thing that brings us together, that establishes common ground for us, is that we both love to backpack in the wilderness. So that brings us together. And I tell that story, the moral of it is, you know, as different as we are, as divided as we are, perhaps there's a chance that love for creation, care for the earth, might be an issue that will go across party lines. Because after all, there is no Democrat mountain, no Republican ocean, no Unitarian Universalist soil, no Christian air. We all depend on those things, so it might bring us together. But here's the truth. As much as that experience in the wilderness gives us common grounds, my brother and I are really, really divided. And we've found that over the years, there are just issues we have decided not to talk about. So after the election, when I was astounded by how many people had diametrically opposed worldviews to my own, how could I be so out of touch with so many? I decided I need to call Al, and we talked. One of the things I think about in the division that exists in our nation is what could tie us together. What could tie us together in our families when they're divided? What could tie us together in our churches, both within or between churches? Sometimes I think that the stories that motivate us are less stories of love and justice and compassion and more stories of fear and hate. And I don't like myself when I'm motivated by fear and hate and mistrust. So I got up the gumption and I called Al and I said, we need to talk. So we talked about Donald Trump and about abortion and Donald Trump and women's reproductive rights and Donald Trump and the EPA and how they're dividing and, destroying so much work that's been done over 20 years and Donald Trump and, all these issues. And I said to him, how is it that you are so conservative and I'm so liberal? And he said, well, I was raised in a conservative home. I said, I was raised in that same home. I asked him, do you know the story about when I came home from college and Dad came to me and said, Doug, what happened to you? I said, what do you mean, what happened? He said, we raised you to be a good Republican. And I said, well, Dad, I found out that Jesus and Moses were Democrats. I was sure that he knew that story. I thought it was part of family folklore, but he'd never heard it before, or if he had, he'd forgotten it. The fact is, there were so many stories that we didn't tell about each other anymore. We had become for one another, even as brothers, sort of a stereotype or a pigeonhole of all the things that we mistrusted and disliked about the other. And so we started telling more stories. Al said, do you remember the time when we got lost in the desert? I said, oh yeah, who could forget the Marlboro Angel? So usually when we go backpacking, we're in beautiful mountain country in central Idaho, but Al was coming down to Arizona, and I got to introduce him to the desert that I've come to love so much. So we drove out the 60 and to the Superstition Mountains, to First Water, Black Mesa Trail. I love this place. And I got to introduce him to plants and animals there. Of course, he's impressed with the saguaro. It stands there so strong, so tall, so independent, so self-made. And I say to him, it's just not true. The saguaro puts out, this beautiful white flower, and then it turns into this red fruit, and the fruit is filled with thousands and thousands of seeds because most of them don't survive in the harshness of the desert. And if it wasn't for the mesquite tree, this welcoming little tree that sends its roots down 75 feet in the ground to get nourishment and then provides shelter and nourishment for all of the other plants and animals, including the saguaro, if it wasn't for this little humble mesquite tree, the saguaros wouldn't survive at all. You can tell the undertones that are involved in every conversation. So I said, Al, you'll like this. The century plant, it's an agave. And we saw some. They were sending its stem up, this magnificent stem going up. Sometimes you can watch it grow 6 inches a day, 25 feet in the air. It grows, and then it flowers. It bursts into florets, and then it dies, and the seeds are dispersed. And I tell Al, I've always identified with that plant. He said, what do you mean? I said, when I was a kid, I used to think if I can live long enough to have sex, I could die a happy man. And Al looked at me out of the corner of his eye and said, "No kidding, you too?" Well, I'm introducing him to the desert, and most of the places we hike, there are just a few animals, megafauna that are spectacular. We saw a moose and her little mooselet, but in the desert, it's crawling with life. Under every rock, there are bees and butterflies and lizards, 15 kinds of lizards and 20 kinds of snakes, and the air is filled with birds, a flash of red for the cardinal and hummingbirds and buzzards. Lots of buzzards circling right over our heads. And I began to realize for the first time, I don't know where I am. Now, this is unusual because I know this place in my imagination so well, I can go over every arroyo, every mesa in my imagination. I've left my compass and my map at home because I think I don't need it. But now I have no idea where we are. Now, the long story, this goes on for 3 or 4 hours wandering. If you've ever hiked this trail in the Superstitions, you run into people all the time. We didn't run into anybody. And we were running low on water, and we were running low on food. And finally, in desperation, Al said, "Why don't we pray about it?" Now, this has been kind of an issue for us over the years. I would come home to visit my family, and the first night I was there, my mother, as we gathered around the oak table, would say to me, "Doug, would you mind giving the blessing tonight?" So I'd pray, "Rock of our salvation, ground of our being." Maybe I'd even throw in some Hebrew that I'd learned in seminary. Barak Atai Adonai Eloheinu. And I can hear my brother across the table grinding his teeth. And then the next night, Mom turns to Al and says, "Al, why don't you give the blessing?" So we'd bow our heads and he'd pray, "Jesus, we just thank you and we just praise you and we just turn to you now, and we're just so unworthy and you're just so loving, and I'm just squirming in my chair." So there we are in the desert, 2 guys who, maybe a manly handshake or a hug that consists of a chest bump and 2 slaps on the back. That's how we touch each other. But we reached out our hands in desperation and we prayed. And Al said, "Doug, why don't you go first?" So I prayed, "Lord Jesus, we just thank you and we just praise you and we turn to you now." And I am so astonished by the words that came out of my mouth that I don't even hear what he says, but I think he said something about the ground of our being. But here's what happened. After that prayer, it was like the scales fell from our eyes. And we knew exactly where to go, and we were in complete agreement. There was only one problem. We were wrong. And now we're more lost than ever, and the water is gone, and the supplies are gone, and we're wandering around when we hear this voice that says, "You guys look like you're lost." And there, underneath this wooden sign that says, "First Water Trailhead, 1 mile," is this guy with a red bandana and a T-shirt and a pack of Marlboro cigarettes rolled up in his sleeve, but he's smoking these little cigarettes. And he says, "Are you lost?" And then he gives us, out of his pack, Cliff Bars, manna in the wilderness. And he gives us Gatorade, water from the rock. And we make it just as it's totally dark to the trailhead. And we're so glad and so relieved, so happy to be there that without any self-consciousness at all, we hug each other with tears in our eyes. And ever since then, when we tell that story and we remember that time, it brings us, divided as we are, a little bit closer together. We are a culture that's lost in the wilderness, divided and lost and not sure which way to turn. Our friends from the Jewish community just celebrated Passover, where they told the story of being lost in the desert and how they were led from bondage to freedom. Did you know that the distance between Cairo and Canaan is only 250 miles? You can make it in 2.5 weeks without working very hard. It took them 40 years. And I don't know why, maybe because Moses left the map and the compass on the table at home, maybe because he was afraid of asking somebody directions, but they say that it didn't take Israel 40 years to get out of Egypt. It took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. And we are filled with Egypt, with empire, with stories that are destroying the earth and destroying each other. Stories with titles like, money is the only thing that matters. Greed is good. The natural world is there for us to pillage and plunder. The poor deserve their fate. The rich, the 1%, deserve their golden towers. And it's destroying the earth. We need to be telling more stories about justice and love and compassion. What was I talking about? So like Melanie said, we gathered here a week and a half ago in this space, and we told stories. Stories about times when we have experienced the holy in the natural world and been transformed by the process. So we had a Jewish synagogue, a liberal Unitarian Universalist church, and an evangelical church coming together to tell those common stories that unite us on this planet, this fragile planet, this Mother Earth. What was I talking about? Amen.